When tragedy strikes, there tends to be an echo. It leaves this thick atmosphere of grief and misfortune. Some call them ghosts. Though tragic, they are altogether harmless, aren't they? These spectres that dwell in the dark shadows of history. But it seems that in at least one instance, these spirits seem to have been vengeful. When Ringo Kelley was found strangled on the exact spot that his friend had died 1 year previous, death that he had been responsible for, people could not help but scratch their heads, wondering whether the dead had returned from the grave to exact their revenge. Hello and welcome back to Certainly Strange. It is episode 5 already of the second season, or episode 20 of the entire podcast if you're counting. So happy 20! Glad to see that you've stuck around, and if you're new here, hello, welcome! Before we start this episode, I just want to mention that if you want to support this podcast, please consider leaving behind a 5-star review on Spotify. It would really help this show getting a bit more recognition. So thank you in advance for that. And now, let's get into the story. In a country as big as the United States of America, evolving during the Industrial Revolution to become the symbol of the modern world, fast transport that covers many miles was very important. This is where the popularity of the steam locomotive came in. In 1819, a tunnel was proposed to be made to connect Boston to upstate New York, which is referred to as the Hoax Tunnel. Workers on the tunnel have, however, an entirely different name for it, calling it the Bloody Pit. During its 22-year construction, the tunnel claimed 196 lives, most dying because of explosions, some by black powder and others by nitroglycerin. And one of these deaths is claimed to be a murder by ghosts. Ringo Kelley, Ned Brinkman and Billy Nash were said to be demolition experts, using nitroglycerin to explode their way through stone to create the tunnel. On March 20th, 1865, Ringo set off an explosion, but it went off too soon. His colleagues, Nash and Brinkman, could not make it back to safety in time and perished in the explosion. After this tragedy, Ringo disappeared, nowhere to be found. He would reappear 1 year later, on March 30th, 1866, dead. Ringo had been murdered by strangulation on the exact spot where Nash and Brinkman had met their fate. Many believe that it had been the vengeful ghosts of Nash and Brinkman themselves who had murdered Ringo, and after all, ghosts were no stranger to the Hoax Tunnel. Paul Travers, a mechanical engineer employed on the Hoax Tunnel, toured the tunnel with a Mr. Dunn. In a letter to his sister dated September 1868, Paul wrote, "The men constantly complain of hearing a man's voice cry out in agony and refuse to enter the great shaft after nightfall. Mr. Dunn has reassured them time and time again that the strange sound is nothing more than the wild wind sweeping down off the mountainside. Our work has slowed to the point where Mr. Dunn asked me to help him conduct an investigation into the matter. So, last night Mr. Dunn and I entered the great tunnel at exactly 9 p.m. We travelled about 2 miles into the shaft and then stopped to listen. As we stood there in the cold silence, we both heard what truly sounded like a man groaning out in pain. As you know, I have heard this same sound many times during the war. Yet, when we turned up the wicks on our lamps, there were no other human beings in the shaft except Mr. Dunn and myself. Mr. Dunn agreed that it wasn't the wind we heard. Perhaps Nash or Brinkman, I wonder." 1 month after this visit, on October 17th, 1868, the worst disaster in the tunnel's history happened. 13 miners perished in a gas explosion. Debris filled the shaft where the miners were working. A miner named Mallory was lowered down in a bucket and rope to search for survivors. Once he was back at the surface, almost unconscious from the fumes, he gasped and uttered 2 words before he died. No hope. With the surface pumping station out of order, the 538-foot shaft started to fill quickly with water. Bodies of some of the dead miners surfaced, but many were still missing. More than a year later, bodies were found on a makeshift raft. The miners who had survived the explosion had built it in desperation to try to float on the rising water. They ended up suffocating from the lack of oxygen as the fires raged. As a result of the many tragedies that occurred in the Hoax tunnel, the gas explosion being the biggest one, there have been many rumours and sightings of ghosts. Shadow men that dwell in the dark, mournful moaning in the distance, and shirts being pulled by invisible hands. In the time between when the gas explosion happened and the raft was found with the dead bodies of the miners on it, villagers claimed that they had been seeing strange shapes and muffled voices coming from the water-filled shaft. Men working on the tunnel have said that they saw the lost miners through a shroud of mist, carrying picks and shovels. When the bodies were eventually found and given a proper burial, these sightings seemed to stop. This does not mean that the Hoax tunnel was entirely free from ghost sightings. Still, people claimed to see spirits, especially one of a miner without a head. On the night of June 25th, 1872, James McKinstry and I entered the great excavation at precisely 11:30 p.m. We had travelled about 2 full miles into the shaft when we finally halted to rest. Except for the dim, smoky light cast by our lamps, the place was as cold and dark as a tomb. James and I stood there talking for a minute or two and were just about to turn back when suddenly I heard a strange, mournful sound. It was just as if someone or something was suffering a great pain. The next thing I saw was a dim light coming along the tunnel from a westerly direction. At first I believed it was probably a workman with a lantern, yet as the light grew closer it took on a strange blue colour and appeared to change shape almost into the form of a human without a head. The light seemed to be floating along about a foot or 2 above the tunnel floor. In the next instant it felt as if the temperature had suddenly dropped and a cold, icy chill ran up and down my spine. The headless form came so close that I could have reached out and touched it, but I was too terrified to move. For what seemed like an eternity, McKinstry and I just stood there, gasping at the headless thing like 2 wooden Indians. The blue light remained motionless for a few seconds, as if it was actually looking us over. Then it floated off towards the east end of the shaft and vanished into thin air. Before we continue, delving into the truths behind these hauntings and the murder of Ringo Kelley, first a word from one of my friends over at the BooPod Network.
Hi, I'm Kristen.
And I'm Jennifer.
And we're the hosts of Haunted or Hoax, a paranormal investigation podcast where we investigate the legends and history, not just the ghosts.
Our locations range from houses down in Savannah, Georgia, murder houses in the Midwest, to hotels in West Virginia.
Additionally, we get together and go on ghost tours and bring the legends and history to you.
Join us every Tuesday as we discuss the legends, history, and experiences from haunted locations.
Available wherever you listen to podcasts.
Bye!
That was the trailer for the podcast Haunted or Hoax. It is actually currently one of my favorite podcasts to listen to because it is just perfect for skeptics who do want to believe in some ghosts but also don't want to take every ghost story at face value. And what I especially like about this podcast is the importance that they give to respecting the dead. Too often you hear paranormal or true crime podcasts either exaggerating or almost fetishizing people's deaths or other tragedies, or they'll be making up some horrible story that is not at all true. This podcast really helps with remembering the true people and the true stories behind certain myths and rumors. I don't know if you're listening, people from Haunted or Hoax, but if you are, great job doing that. It is always important to remember the facts. And having said that, let's delve into the facts behind the hauntings of the Hoax tunnel and the alleged murder of Ringo Kelley by ghosts. When talking about the story of Ringo Kelley and his colleagues of whose deaths he is responsible, let's take a look into the past. What is so strange about this story is that there was nothing reported at the time. Of course, miners died often by explosions, but I could not find a word of any murder occurring in the Hoax tunnel until an article in Yankee magazine in 1973, in volume 37 on page 133. So that is a good 107 years after the murder is supposed to have happened. The story in the magazine was written more as a ghost story than it was written as an actual account of events that really occurred during the construction of the tunnel. And this is just one of these examples that I just talked about, where some gruesome story is made up for the purpose of entertainment, whilst there was actual tragedy going on all around during the construction of the tunnel. Because the gas explosion, where all those men died, 13 men died, that really happened. And whilst there is no historical accounts of any deaths of Ringo, Nash or Brinkman, there is plenty of evidence that the gas explosion did happen and that many people did die because of it. And moreover, there is no evidence to suggest that there was ever any Ringo, Kelley, Ned Brinkman or Billy Nash excavating the Hoax tunnel. First of all, I couldn't find their graves on Find a Grave, and besides that, Francis William Bird mentioned in 1868 that one Mr. Crocker was in charge of excavating the tunnel in 1865. So no Ringo Kelley, no Ned Brinkman, no Billy Nash, a Mr. Crocker. So that makes you wonder, is there any possibility that there is some truth behind the story? Well, there is one Mr. Kalmbach, and he was a very successful engineer at the time that the tunnel was being excavated, and he just came to observe the construction of the tunnel one day, and he observed that the use of nitroglycerin was so excessive that it could be very dangerous for workers. So perhaps workers did die because of an explosion being set off too soon. And perhaps their names were Brinkman and Nash, because these names were mentioned in that letter of Paul Travis that I read. And yeah, but next to that, a murder by ghosts, well, that is just not very likely. Does this mean that the Hoax tunnel is not haunted at all? Well, with so much tragedy in that place, so much so that the tunnel was nicknamed the Bloody Pit, it would not surprise me if this tragedy did leave an echo in the form of ghosts. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Certainly Strange. Please consider leaving behind a review on Spotify and following us on Instagram at Certainly Strange the podcast. Everything about the podcast can be found on the website certainlystrange.com, where you can find a transcript of the episode as well as all the sources that I used in my research. And once again, thank you for listening. Bye!